So, Ian, I have to ask you about the next stage of this. It seems like President Donald Trump is already talking about the post phase in terms of getting the economy back ramping up. How can he be already on that, tweeting out today, we cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself, when we haven't even fixed the initial part of the problem? We haven't even got stimulus out to Main Street. The Fed is doing all it can, but basically we're going into a series of shutdowns city over city these days.
Well, it's a very good question, but it's actually an example of Trump saying what everybody else is thinking, certainly other global leaders, because, right now, all of the political incentives are towards shutting it down and shutting it down fast. In fact, leaders around the world that are doing that are seeing an electoral bounce, irrespective of the economic consequence, because there's a lot of panic, there's a lot of concern, and people want to see leadership. In South Korea, in France, in Italy, the numbers are going up for those folks. But Trump also understands that the economic damage that is going to come from shutting down the economy for a significant period of time, the supply and demand side of the economy is going to be immense. And while you can get a couple $1 trillion package through expeditiously right now, it's not necessarily easy to get the next rounds of stimulus done, as they will probably be necessary, especially as you're talking about more than 2-4 weeks of real significant shutdown. And so he's also saying, the massive amount of pressure to get the economy moving again, especially after you feel like you have enough tests in place to get more information. No, you're not going to have a vaccine. No, you're not going to have drugs that scale to combat the virus, but you are going to have more surge capacity in place in different cities around the country. He's looking forward to that. I think the danger is that in an election year, number one, and given the extraordinary dysfunction of politics, not just in the U.S., but globally, the likelihood that you are going to get some restarts of economies that will happen before you have a real handle on coronavirus and you get more outbreaks, that is a very, very real danger and vulnerability. And what he tweeted last night, everyone is going to be saying over the course of the next few weeks and months.
Ian, how incredible is it that we have a Federal Reserve announcing stimulus, which includes stimulus for small businesses? It actually carries limits on paying dividends and making stock buybacks for firms that defer interest payments. How incredible is it that we have a Federal Reserve going to this lengths to try and bridge the gap that Washington just is not bridging?
I don't think it's incredible at all. If you look, this is not just the United States. While there's no coordination between the G7 economies, they're all moving towards this kind of stimulus. Right now, assuming the package that we expect to clear Congress does go through in short order, and I'm almost certain it will, you're talking about 7.5% to 10% of GDP in stimulus. Compare that to 5% of GDP, 2008 and 2009 tranches combined in the United States. And we're going to need that kind of 10% global financial package globally. We're going to need it, and the developed countries can do it by themselves. We're going to need it for developing countries as well. And that's going to be extraordinarily challenging to do. That means mobilizing the IMF and all the other international financial institutions at full capacity. It means coordinated swaps among central banks to keep liquidity going in emerging markets. This is going to be the top priority to avoid massive crisis. I really am not surprised by that, given what we're seeing.
Ian, what are the implications of President Trump calling it the China virus?
Well, first of all, let's keep in mind that the virus did indeed explode because of the cover-up in China. That not just the Chinese explosion, but also the fact that it came out of China because millions were traveling from Wuhan. And that's why you got the outbreaks in Iran and in Italy and in Washington state. So, some accountability and responsibility for the Chinese here is important. And indeed, the Chinese government took the unprecedented step of exonerating the whistleblower doctor that was reprimanded for initially finding and trying to announce this virus, and it was covered up by the Chinese government. So let's first of all be very clear about that. But let's also recognize that the potential of picking a fight with the Chinese government right now is not really smart, right? I mean, our economies are massively intertwined. We rely on the Chinese for an awful lot, not least of which is all of our medical supply chain, our pharmaceutical supply chain. And of course, our economy is right now really doing badly. The market's giving back all of the gains under the entire Trump administration bull market so far, and perhaps significantly further to fall. So, I mean, while I completely get that there are patriotic reasons to want to couch this as a war against a foreign virus, it's also a global pandemic, and you need a global response if you want to get the global economy out of the toilet. And there's a danger that if Trump really beats on the Chinese, that it's going to get a lot more challenging to rebuild the global economy, of which the United States is the single largest component. He clearly understands that tension. You saw it in his press conference yesterday when he was still, and he's blaming China, but he's also saying, well, they did Xi Jinping is my friend. They did the phase 1 trade deal. We can still work with these guys. They're still going to buy a lot of ag from America, which they're certainly not going to do this year, given the state of their economy. But there are a lot of people in Congress, and there are a lot of people in Trump's own cabinet that really would like to see, you know, more of a Cold War footing against the Chinese. And the Chinese are running laps around the Americans in public diplomacy right now around the world. Also very different from 2008, 2009.
Ian, Congress is struggling to come together. We have seen that over the last couple of days. What are the implications of that again, and what are the implications of that for the upcoming election in November?
Implications of that right now are fairly limited in my view. I mean, it's an election period, and yes, the Democrats and Republicans have some significant differences, and the politics are pretty ugly. I mean, when you have, for example, an effort to include loans to nonprofit organizations through the Small Business Administration because they employ millions of people, these nonprofits. You clearly want to get money to them, but there are a number of Republicans in Congress that would sooner see a depression in the United States than give money for abortions through Planned Parenthood. I mean, you know, you've got fights like that that we shouldn't be having, that we're having, and it's slowing this down a bit. But I assure you that is not going to derail the stimulus. In fact, what it probably does is make it a little bit bigger and a little bit less efficient, because in an election year, if you can't agree, everybody gets what they want. All must have prizes. So, you know, in the near term, I think that the stimulus is absolutely on track and will be massive, as it has been across Europe, as it is in Japan. But as we move towards the elections, you know, the potential that our election gets seriously messed up and seen to be delegitimized by this process is very, very real, right? I mean, the impeachment seems a long time ago, but that was an effort by Trump to get an investigation going against Joe Biden. Joe Biden's now going to be the nominee. You think that's not going to come up again? Of course it is. You think that we're not going to have difficulties in changing the way people actually go to the polls because you're going to have folks scared of meeting together, so it might have to be done by mail or digitally? What about the potential of external intervention? Are people going to say it's going to be rigged? All of this is a serious problem. You really don't want that happening in response to the greatest crisis of our lifetimes.